During World War II, Milton Friedman, now some alleged free market economist, came up with his great proposal of the withholding tax, which of course is now part of the American heritage, where the tax is painlessly withheld from you on your paycheck every month. And it's only the use of withholding tax that's permitted this vast, enormous increase in income tax rates. It's pretty clear that without that, nobody would be paying up much, if at all. Withholding tax was originally supposed to be a temporary wartime measure. As soon as World War II was over, they said it would be eliminated, purely for the emergency. Of course, that was the last we heard of that. As Madison once said, something like, every emergency is used by the government becomes part of the permanent instrument of power by the government. Something, a phrase to that effect. And boy, is that true. So, and withholding tax, by the way, one thing with withholding tax is it really violates the 13th Amendment, the anti-slavery amendment, because what it does is it forces every employer to withhold taxes from their employees without getting paid for it. I mean, the employer doesn't even get expenses for this. The employer is forced by law to spend his time withholding other people's taxes. So the employer is an unpaid, coerced laborer for the government. At any rate, this comes in World War II. The income tax comes in fortuitously just in time, along with the Federal Reserve System, to finance the entire World War I war effort, of which these guys are living. We also have statistics comes in. The idea of government statistics with Edwin Gay, who comes in as an economic historian at Harvard and dean of the Harvard School of Business Administration, comes in and becomes sort of the statistics czar in World War I. It was small and general resources. The amount of money going to it wasn't very much. It's very important. The government can't exist without statistics. They can't plan anything. They don't know what the hell's going on. And so statistics become a key, important nodal point for the government to pour money into to try to collect, to use then to plan the system and to cartelize, whatever they want to do. Now notice, I'm going to give you some key quotes here. Notice, for example, Harry Wheeler, who was president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which I said came into being because the federal government wanted a group of businessmen to represent business in some sense. He said the War Services Committees, remember the War Services Committee, well, they're in groups of industries, and different industries too, which negotiated with the commodity section chiefs. There were price-fixing committees, and for each industry, or the magazine Iron Age, which is the official organ of the American Iron and Steel Institute, said it has apparently taken the most gigantic war in all history, which in those days was World War I, to give the idea of cooperation any such place in the general economic program as the country's steel manufacturers sought to give it in their own industry. So in other words, here's a marvelous situation. The war is just great because it provides this instrument of cartelization, of quote cooperation, of course, with government and among industry as a whole. Another thing that Hoover did, I should mention, in this voluntary effort, he put out literally millions of pamphlets to get the propaganda pamphlets, get the public to do various things, I think it was World War I began a clean plate program. Everybody should clean their plate for the war effort. I don't know what it has to do with the war effort. It was a method of social control, and it was a method of trying to get people to increase their demand for food, I guess, or to quote, conserve food. It seems to have very little to do with it, but a friend of mine who was a sociology professor got his start. His first job, he graduated in World War II. The same thing happened in World War II. He got his first sociology job in World War II in the Department of Agriculture, I guess it was. And he was engaged in a clean plate program. And they said the slogan of the program was, clean your plate and kill Japs, or something like that. Starve a Jap and clean your plate. And they would go around, they'd spy on all the garbage cans. They had, whatever the area was, Philadelphia, to make sure that there was no food being thrown out. So this is part of the war wastage, no waste program. Starve a Jap today. Clean your plate and starve a Jap today was the slogan. It was from this experience he conceived a total hatred of the federal government, which he has to this day. And anybody who disobeyed any government programs, with Hoover programs, was then put a stigma on it being unpatriotic and pro-German or pro-Japanese later on, whatever. And every one of these defense contracts or war contracts in the war production program was, of course, cost plus. This is the beginning of the cost plus doctrine, where you guarantee any cost, recovery of any cost, plus a guarantee rate of profit. Of course, beloved by these businesses, they could sit back and allow that cost to float upward, and the taxpayer pays for it. This, of course, is now the whole nub of the current defense program too. So the whole idea of the government repaying all costs plus a fixed guaranteed profit rate begins in World War I. Another great contribution in World War I to the economy. The wheat program goes way up. There's a wheat price fixing program, of course, keeping it high. The government was allegedly keeping down the wheat price. Actually, it kept it up. It went up from $2 a bushel to $3 a bushel in 2 months. This was overall an enormous increase, 50% increase in 2 months. And then after the war is over, they kept the minimum price for until the summer of 1919 at $2 a bushel to keep it from falling. So it's obvious that the whole idea was to keep the price up as high as possible. They also had a gigantic boondoggle in World War I called which was dropped out of the history books, called the Hog Island program, Hog Island plant. They got a plant to build ships for the war effort. And the idea is that they had a mammoth shipbuilding plant at Hog Island, which is a swamp. It wasn't really an island. It's a swamp south of Philadelphia, between Philadelphia and Delaware. And they got they bought the land. The land was worthless land. It was swamp land. They bought the land for $2 an acre or something like that. And they sold it. Then they resold it to the government for $1,000 an acre, something like that. An enormous profit they got. And the whole thing is a gigantic boondoggle. The first ship that came off the docks at the end of 1919, after the war was over, they started pouring ships out, freighters, called Liberties ships. And they were actually competing, and they were actually doing things peacetime until about 1921 when the whole thing died out. But again, they were closely connected. The guys running this thing were closely connected with the Morgan interests. They were Vanadian Corporation or something like that. I have all the stuff home on that one. But anyway, this is an enormous multi-million-dollar boondoggle. It's the Hog Island caper, which there were a lot of congressional investigations trying to figure out what's going on, and was quietly suppressed, the investigation, that is. Another thing that begins, by the way, or comes to a peak around this period, continues for the rest of the 20th century, the Cuban crisis. In other words, again, this is very similar in the late 19th century. The Cuba is producing sugar, was its major product. The United States is imposing sugar import quotas for the benefit of the sugar growers in Louisiana and the mountain states, beet sugar. And it's constantly adjusting the quotas. And then, of course, the Cubans are worried about trying to increase their quotas and all the rest of it. So that comes to a head in World War I also, where they want to get sugar at a certain fixed price. And so, in other words, sugar becomes a part of an international power play instead of just an economic venture on the market. So the idea is to fix the price of sugar low enough the American sugar refiners would like it, but high enough so the American sugar producers would like it. So it's one of these things that keeps changing all the time, what this alleged optimum point is. Our Cuban tool those days was a guy named General Garcia Menacao, who was the dictator. He founded a sugar mill in Cuba, along with he founded the Cuban American Company, which had the largest sugar estate in the world and a sugar mill. Along with a Texas congressman named Koli, he borrowed $10 million from J.P. Morgan and Company. Of course, there's always the Morgan connection in this thing. And he engineered a fraudulent re-election. This, of course, can sound very, very familiar. Fraudulent re-election in 1916 of Menacao, and then he was kicked out by a liberal revolution. 1917. And remember, there's a liberal revolution, no commies in this period yet. Can't blame this on communism. Since he was there, since he was in with the Morgans and in with the Congressman Hawley, etc., Menacao, the United States immediately condemned the liberal revolution and accused the liberals of being German spies. You couldn't accuse them of being commies. There were no commies then. So the enemy then was Germany. They were all German agents, German spies, German agents, and The United States then came to the support of Menachos, and Menachos to be reestablished because Menachos had a constitutional government, quote unquote. It was a fraudulent election. The United States then shipped guns and ammunition to Menachos, plus 500 Marines, U.S. Marines who landed in Cuba, several points in Cuba, to support of Menachos, brought Menachos back and crushed the liberal revolution. The United States then put pressure on Cuba to declare war against Germany too. I'm sure the Germans were not exactly hurt, not severely injured by Cuban declaration. And we threatened if Cuba did not declare war on Germany that they would not buy their sugar. In other words, the sugar quota would be dumped, and we wouldn't buy any more Cuban sugar. Menachos very quickly gave in. Of course, he said, "Okay, of course, yes, master, we will declare war against Germany." And when he declared war, shortly after the United States did, his reason for it, since obviously Cuba had no gripe against Germany, no conceivable gripe, his reason was because of the pacts and obligations which bind us to the United States. A key advisor to this whole thing, a key guy on the Latin American desk of the State Department during the war was none other than young John Foster Dulles. He was only about 18 or something like that, very young in this period, but pops up now as a key figure, later to become Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and to be an advisor at Versailles Treaty, etc. John Foster Dulles was a Foster nephew of John Foster, who had been Secretary of State in the 1880s, and he got Menachos a, quote, request, unquote, quote, voluntarily, unquote, that the United States station permanent Marines in Cuba, which we then happily accepted. So that the United States then stationed 2,600 Marines in Cuba until 1923, in other words, for 6 years, almost a semi-permanent. And this is true of much of Latin America, that the Marines would come in under almost any circumstances. And the excuse was to aid in the protection of sugar properties and mining properties. So, and I guess it's Menachos and Morgan Sugar. Menachos continued to govern until 1921 with Marine support of the Marines, governing by decree, suspending elections, or falsifying votes, and reaping huge private profits, which he put, I guess, in whatever was then the equivalent of numbered Swiss bank accounts. He also enforced export licenses like the United States, press censorship like the United States had at the time of the war, postal and telegraph censorship, and espionage acts. The United States had an espionage act, locking up people as alleged agents on not much pretext. Menachos followed suit. And all this was put through by the help of U.S. advisors, in case he didn't know how to pass an espionage act or set up the apparatus. And also incorporated all the rules and edicts of Hoover's Food Administration. Now, one of the things that we have to realize, I haven't had a chance to go into all the foreign policy actions of the late 19th century and early 20th, but you have to realize all these things are being done. Like Marines are being shipped in. For example, a typical thing would be this. A Latin American country borrows or sells bonds or borrows money from Chase National Bank or sells bonds to American bondholders, and then they start defaulting. Okay? So then the question is, are these default on the bonds? What should be done about it? And so the United States was pressuring these countries, Haiti, Dominican Republic, whatever, Nicaragua, etc., to raise taxes in these countries so they could pay off the American bondholders. Since obviously the people of those countries didn't want to have their taxes raised, there was a certain amount of friction there, and they refused to do it, and the United States would send Marines down to force them to raise taxes or tariffs or whatever to pay off American bondholders. So much of the American intervention in Latin America was that sort of thing. In other words, the United States intervenes on behalf of the American bondholders, whether bankers or other bondholders, to force these countries to increase their taxes. And all of this has been forgotten by Americans. I don't think there's hardly any American in the United States who knows or cares about this. But in Latin America, of course, they remember this very well. So the perception of the United States-Latin American relations is very different in the two regions. They remember each of these interventions, and they were bitterly opposed to it. Oh, another thing that happens in World War I is the nationalization of the railroads. I alluded to this a little bit last time, I think. They were, quote, nationalized. The U.S. government took them over, and the United States government then ran them. And you might think, well, gee, the railroad interests must have opposed this. On the contrary, they're very happy about it for several reasons. The Interstate Commerce Commission, which had been put in by the railroads, the railroads had lost control of the ICC to the shippers by about 1900 or so. In other words, the shippers, the people, the industries who were using the railroads began to take over, and so they started setting the railroad rates low rather than high. So the railroads were very bitter at the ICC during this period. They're anxious to find a way to get out from under the ICC. And then the way the thing was worked out, the U.S. government nationalized the railroads, paid all the operating costs, in other words, ran the railroads, paid the costs, usually deficits, expenses, and gave the private railroads a guaranteed profit rate all during the war. So in other words, the private railroads incurred no cost. They just sat back, collected a guaranteed profit. The U.S. government ran the railroads. It was great for the railroad. They loved it. And then they could set the rates higher, too. In addition to everything else, they could set the freight rates because they got out from under the ICC, which had now turned against their creator. So, for example, the people who started agitating for this nationalization were the railroads themselves. Daniel Willard, who was the head of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, who becomes head of the Railroad Czar, the first Council of National Defense. Daniel Willard becomes sort of the main railroad guy, and he starts pushing for nationalization right away. He's president of B&O. And the railroads were also agitated for what they called scientific management of the railroads, which meant higher rates and cartelization, of course. So when the federal government decided to take it over in 1917, one thing they did is, at the end of 1917, they guaranteed to the railroads a very high profit rate, essentially their average 1916 to 17 profit rate, base profit rate. They set up a railroad administration to run these nationalized railroads. The official head of it was Secretary of Treasury McAdoo. Of course, we know as a Morgan tool. But he, of course, had other things to do. I mean, he was also Secretary of the Treasury, so he was like the nominal head of the railroad administration. And the real head, the vice chairman, who really becomes the basic head of it, was a guy named Walker Hines, who was chairman of the board of the Santa Fe Railroad. And the whole railroad administration were railroad executives. They would just take, borrowed, so to speak, from their respective railroads to form the so-called cabinet of the railroad administration. And they ran the railroads, and they ensured a railroad bonanza. So now, for example, they set the rates for the railroads, and they raised the freight rates very happily, which the ICC had not allowed them to do. They also did something else. They really screwed the shippers. For example, before World War I, if you, for example, you're shipping freight from one place to another, first of all, the railroads are guaranteed the time of departure. You have to depart at a certain time. Second of all, any liability, if your goods got damaged en route, the railroads had to pay for it. Now, this is the way the market worked. Well, the railroad administration immediately started redesigning the railroads, which continued from then on, by the way, after the war was over, too. They said in the name of elimination of waste and efficiency in the war effort and all that jazz, first of all, we're going to allow the railroads to keep freight over here and not ship it out until each car is fully loaded up. You're not going to send out half-full cars, because obviously railroads prefer to wait until their shipment, it's like a plane waiting until the plane is filled up. You might wait 3 days, what the hell? So the rules were then changed by the railroad administration so that the shippers had to wait until the car was filled up. And second of all, the shippers had to take any losses. If there's any damage to the goods, tough. The railroads didn't have to pay for it. This was put in as an alleged wartime measure, which obviously the railroad cartel measure was a measure to screw the shippers for the benefit of the railroads. And the railroads, of course, loved this. They thought the railroad administration was great. See, most people, if you look at it, say, gee, the railroads were had to sacrifice during the war because they were nationalized. They loved it. Their own people were running it. And they were handing it, and they were consulting with the railroad people in order to decide what measures to take, what rules to put in the name of efficiency and standardization and all that. And they eliminate a lot of competition, a lot of intra-railroad competition. It's inefficient to have, wasteful to have competition. So eliminate how many railroads are on each different route, or how many railroads are on any given territory. Just like they eliminated different grades or varieties of products in general, but they said it's inefficient to have 150 kinds of clothing. Let's have only 30 kinds, things like that. All this is a method of reducing diversity and thereby lowering the standard of living of consumers in order to benefit selected big businesses or selected big railroads in this case. So, in other words, cartelization using the government as the instrument. This continued on. This is, by the way, was originally illegal. It was then legalized in March 1918 in the Federal Control Act, which legalized the takeover, so to speak. Again, put through by the railroad lobbyists and the railroad administration people working together. And in the spring of 1918, as they got going, they amassed a 25% across the board increase in freight rates, which they wanted all this time, which the railroads had tried to put through and couldn't do it. And they did that with no hearings, by the way. Usually when the government does something, or any public utility commission does something, they have a lot of hearings. There's testimony. They didn't do no testimony, just did it. Also, of course, the passenger rate increase. The passenger freight rates, of course, was the bread and butter of railroad industry. So after the war was over, the railroads sort of liked the idea to continue on. They were happy. They would be happy to have this permanent. What the hell? They sit back. They don't have to do anything, and they get a high profit rate, and the government picks up the operating losses. But what finally happened by the early 1920s is the ICC became under railroad domination again. The railroads allowed denationalization to go back under the old system, except now the ICC under railroad dominance. There's another quote from Bernard Baruch as he looked back on his war experiences. Many businesses have experienced during the war, for the first time in their careers, many businessmen, I should say, the tremendous advantages, both to themselves and to the general public, of combination of cooperation and common action. In other words, the cartels. He said, we should eliminate waste completely. We should have it permanently. We should have the channel of supply and demand so they would meet. Allocate production, avoid extravagant competition, as he called it. And that all business should be governed by a federal agency, quote, whose duty it should be to economize under strict government supervision, to encourage, such cooperation and coordination. And so when the Depression hit, for example, in 1930, Baruch was right there with a plan for what we call a Supreme Court of Industry, a new War Industries Board, what we call, a Peace Industries Board or something, and do the same thing. As a matter of fact, McAdoo came out with what he called a Peace Industries Board to coordinate, to raise prices, restrict production, and all the rest of it, which is what the National Recovery Administration did, what Roosevelt did in the NRA, simply do that, institutionalize it, and have a series of codes, production codes, price codes, etc., so that, for example, it worked very much like Bismarck's Germany or fascist Italy. In other words, if you remember the steel industry, you have to join the Steel Association, you have to obey the code set down by the NRA and the steel branch or whatever, almost a duplicate of the War Industries Board, except frankly cartelizing that. So you have to have minimum prices and maximum production quotas for each firm as a alleged way of trying to get out of the Depression. Anytime you pour in consumer purchasing power through deficits, etc. But this is the cartelizing branch. The head of the NRA, I think Roosevelt asked Bernard Baruch to be head of it. By the time he's getting old, and he said, "No, it's all right. My buddy Hugh Johnson can do it." So Johnson was the head of the NRA, and George Peake, the founder of the Farm Price Support Program, was the head of the AAA, the Agriculture Adjustment Administration, which is the farm equivalent, the Roosevelt's farm equivalent of the NRA. In other words, farm price supports, restricting production quotas on every product, killing every third hog. For example, the hog production had been cut by a third, plow under every third wheat acre, and that sort of thing. So this is a farm price program, which is very much the way it is now. Acreage control, maximum acreage control, maximum production, hopefully, minimum prices. headed by George Peake. And these are both declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1935-36. This came in 33. The last gasp of the Supreme Court as an independent body declared these unconstitutional, and then they were essentially reconstructed informally, at least the AAA was, Department of Agriculture. The NRA wasn't, but again in World War II, the same sort of thing comes in as in World War I. It's almost a duplicate. Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles, a top Rockefeller lawyer, J.F. Dulles. The secretary, the head of the CIA, which is virtually as important in foreign policy as Secretary of State, especially in those days. There was no auditing, nothing, no inspection. They just did it whatever they wanted. Head of the CIA was his brother Allen W. Dulles, who was also head of the OSS during World War II, this espionage outfit in World War II, which then became the CIA. And two Dulles brothers running foreign policy, and plus the sister Eleanor Lansing Dulles, who's head of the Berlin desk of the State Department. So we had, in other words, you talk about a power elite. This is one family, two brothers and a sister, running all American foreign policy. Pretty remarkable. You can't tell me they're the only people qualified in the country to conduct foreign policy. So see, what happens after World War II, to leap ahead, of course, from the current situation, is the whole Morgan-Rockefeller thing, which we'll go through in the 20s also. The Morgan-Rockefeller warfare continues until World War II, basically. In other words, it's all during the 20s and 30s, with Morgan more or less fairly dominant, but Rockefeller is also important. With World War II and after World War II, the whole scene shifts because oil becomes dominant, and so the Rockefellers take over. There's no longer any warfare because the Morgans are now junior partners to Rockefeller. Rockefellers are dominant. They run the whole show. And so what we have after World War II is essentially the Rockefellers taking over what's now called the Eastern Establishment. Everybody else is a subsidiary. Rockefellers is one out within that power struggle. The war is over. The railroads were happy to return to the private ownership, except now the ICC, since they were controlling the ICC again, they were willing to do that. And labor relations, the War Industry Board and there was a War Labor Policies Board. Unions were created. In other words, the corporatist program of creating unions in order to deal with them, to deal with the working class and sort of channel them in the desired directions, was set up so that the War Industries Board and the War Labor Policies Board and the War Labor Board, a whole bunch of them, essentially engaged in compulsory unionization. So that for firms that were engaging in defense contracts, were forced to unionize, were forced to deal with unions. So what you had then was an enormous increase in union membership. Remember I said before that before the World War I, union membership as a percentage of the labor force varied from about 2% to about 8%, something like that. And it concentrated in certain specific areas, construction and building trades and anthracite coal, skilled labor, craft unions. So it was down to about 3% or so, let's say, when the war started. And because of the World War I, because of the compulsory unionism which the federal government engaged in, membership went up to 14% in 1918. It was a big increase of union membership, unprecedented increase in union membership from about 3%, which is sort of a norm around there, to a sudden 14% because of the federal government encouragement, at the behest of big business. Remember, the big business groups, the Morgans and the Rockefellers and all the rest of them, had come to the conclusion that they wanted a corporatist system. In other words, a cartelized system. Part of the idea was to have the workers represented in unions, which would then be part of this tripartite process. The unions going along with the system. So that every war industry thing always had one union representative, like Samuel Gompers, people like that. Also, the unions were used, since socialism is, in a sense, semi-prominent. Socialist Party was fairly important in this period. The AFL unions were used as pro-war to induct the laborers and unions and socialists with a pro-war spirit. They're used, in other words, to be the pro-war heads of labor, so to speak. And the Socialist Party, by the way, split, as all the European Socialist parties did when the war started. The Marxist program, of course, was against imperialist wars, what they call imperialist wars. And yet, in every European country, the Socialist Party or Social Democratic Party, the majority came out in favor of their respective war efforts, except in the United States, where the majority of the Socialist Party continued to be against the war. The split-off group, the Social Democratic Federation, as you recall, became with the pro-war people. Interestingly enough, the head of the Socialist Party in the United States, Eugene Victor Debs, was arrested in World War I because he was anti-war, locked up for the duration of the war effort, and later. There was very little civil liberties in World War I. If you continue to oppose the war, once it got started, you were usually locked up and considered to be a German agent, and so forth and so on. So Debs was jailed during the war because of opposition to the war effort. When the war was over, Woodrow Wilson refused to commute the sentence, refused to pardon him. So the guys were subversive, etc., refused to do it. When Warren Harding got in, here's Wilson, a supposed progressive. When Harding, a so-called conservative, gets in, he immediately freed Debs. When the war is over, what's the point of keeping him in jail? When the NRA, when the National Recovery Administration came in 1933 as part of the New Deal, recartelizing the economy to fight the Depression, not only was the head of it, George Hugh Johnson, a Baruch person, War Industries Board person in World War I, all the other officials were too, most of the other people. John Hancock was an old friend of Baruch, a co-author of the Baruch, was a big shot in the NRA in 1933. He was the Paymaster General of the Navy in World War I and head of the Naval Industrial Program for the War Industries Board. Dr. Leo Woolman is the head of the Production Statistics Division of the War Industries Board and became a member of the NRA and also the War Labor, which the NRA also set up the National Labor Board, and he was a member of that. There's a whole bunch of them. It just goes on and on. A whole bunch of these people who had been in the World War I War Industries Board, Food Administration, they all rushed back in the New Deal period. But they really constituted the ranks of the New Deal in 1933. Boy, do they love it. This is it, boy, we're back in action. Also, they kept using war terminology during the New Deal period. In other words, when they reconstituted all this stuff, they would hark back consciously to World War I. For example, Roosevelt said, I don't share any of these doubts on the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. He said, quote, I took part in the Great Cooperation in 1917 and 1918, and it is my faith that we can count on our industry once more to join in our general purpose to fight this new threat being the Depression. In other words, Germany is one threat, the Depression is another threat. All considered on the same sort of level. The Blue Eagle, the insignia of the NRA, which was put in by Roosevelt, which was taken from the old Herbert Hoover Food Administration, was suggested to Roosevelt by Baruch. And as Baruch said about the using this old method of this logo or symbol, symbolized this cartelist battle, he said, quote, said Baruch, if it is commonly understood that those who are cooperating are soldiers against the enemy within, and those who omit to act are on the other side, there will be little hanging back. In other words, just as the anti-German forces who were abiding by War Food Administration regulations had their insignia to show they were part of this fight, and so those who put the Blue Eagle of the New Deal on their windows were also part of the great fight. The enemy within being unemployment or whatever you want to call it. Also, the conscription comes in World War I. In addition to the income tax, Federal Reserve System conscription comes in, of course, to draft people for the war effort, and using a very similar techniques. The idea was again to have local citizens, unpaid citizens, do the drafting. So it's to mobilize these. So instead of thinking it's the central government who were drafting people, it's the local boards, local selective service boards who were doing it. And then become sort of, again, unpaid agents of the government, unpaid enforcement agents. And in the same way, the NRA had local compliance committees to go out and make sure everybody's got the Blue Eagle and abides by the Blue Eagle decisions and so forth and so on. They're made up of the, quote, best people, unquote, in the community, whatever that means. Responsible citizens to enforce these things, not hippie types. Those who will be trusted to go along with the government at all times. Mrs. Peake writes about George Peake. Her memoir about George Peake, who was head of the AAA, was also originally part of the War Industries Board, one of Baruch's people. She said to him, that means Peake, with his war experience meaning the War Industries Board, of course, this whole thing clicks into shape. And some of the fine men of the country are coming to his call, as they did in 1917, with the same high purpose, this time fighting depression, quote unquote, with the same kind of cartelist vision. New Republic, which you remember was set up by the Morgan partner Willard Straight as their intellectual arm, of course also hoops it up for the war effort. In fact, most of these guys were calling for war with Germany long before Wilson actually asked for it. Teddy Roosevelt kept accusing Wilson of being a coward for not declaring war, by 1914, much less 1917. And so the intellectuals poured into the government, as I say, as apologists, propagandists, and planners, both in the war and again in the New Deal period. In other words, it's a very similar kind of situation. They learned in World War I, and then they continued it on in the New Deal, and then again in World War II. Almost the same people, even though it was 20 years later. The New Republic also said, for example, Herbert Crowley is the editor of the New Republic. Looking back on the wars, boy, do they love it. They said, during the war, we revolutionized our society. I guess in a sense they did. They made it much more statist and collectivist, quasi-permanently. John Dewey, a great philosopher, progressive philosopher, Columbia University, and founder of pragmatism and semi-socialist and everything else, said that the war was great because during the war we learned to produce for use instead of producing for profit. Ignoring the fact, of course, these guys were making lots of money out of the war effort. But anyway, so John Dewey was leading the march of the progressive pragmatism intellectuals in favor of the war. All of Dewey's disciples. Dewey talked about the power of war to force concerted effort and collective planning. So war is a great thing, you see, because it means that everybody is forced to join together in a collective effort. This sounds very much like what the communists were saying. I guess it's true for their purposes. Not much difference. Yeah. Herbert Crowley is the editor of the New Republic, progressive intellectual, author of Teddy Roosevelt's major theoretician and guru. J.P. Morgan was his major financial backer. And also it's a beautiful circle, you see. What happens is the Morgan partner sets up the New Republic, publishes it. Crowley's the editor. Crowley's the major theoretician for Teddy Roosevelt. Himself was a Morgan too all of his life. Founder of the idea of what he called the new nationalism, Hamiltonism. He said Jefferson's a bad guy because Jefferson's in favor of liberty and free market and minimal government. Hamilton was a great guy. Hamilton was in favor of big government industry partnership, all the rest of the stuff. Crowley's father was a Saint-Simonian socialist. Saint-Simonian was a believer in one of the few Saint-Simonians in the United States, and Crowley imbibed this at his father, and then continued on, went to Harvard, learned about pragmatism and all the rest of it, and combined all this stuff into one mighty rotten synthesis. No sense of being value-free in this thing. They weren't value-free. Say that. Rex Tugwell, famous collectivist, economist, and one of the big people in the New Deal period, the leader of the so-called collectivist wing of the New Deal. When you talk about collectivist wing of the New Deal, you're dealing with very subtle distinctions here. At any rate, Rexford Guy Tugwell, I guess in the Department of Agriculture, but he's one of the so-called brain trust in the New Deal period. He wrote about World War I, looking back on it, 1921-22. He said, gee, it was a great war. He talked about America's wartime socialism. He hailed it as being great. It was socialist. The only thing we have to realize, it wasn't proletarian. It wasn't Marxist-Leninist. It was big business It was this kind of corporatist socialism, big business, big government collaboration, and big union, or creation of new big unions. And he said that it was a terrible thing the war ended when it did. I mean, most of these people didn't really come out flatly and say this. They believed it. They didn't quite have the gall to say it. It's too bad the war ended as early as 1918, because if he said, quote, only the armistice, in November 18, only the armistice prevented a great experiment in control of production, control of price, and control of consumption. In other words, prevented the sort of establishment of permanent collectivism. And he said, during the war, said Tugwell, competition, the old system of competition had, quote, melted away in the free and new heat of nationalistic vision, unquote. So, and then, of course, when Mussolini's fascism came in Italy in the early 1920s, all these guys loved it. Tugwell loved it. Herbert Koli loved it. If you read The New Republic, it's very instructive to go back and read The New Republic, for example, late 1920s. Koli was still the editor. They loved Mussolini. They thought fascism was great because fascism had now achieved in peacetime what the World War I had achieved in wartime, what the United States and Britain and France, etc., Germany had achieved in wartime. Italy had finally established permanently as a triad, a corporate state system of national trade associations, central planning, fixing of production and prices and all the rest of it. In fact, the civil liberties had to go by the board. They didn't really care that much about. Who cares about civil liberties? People far away. They didn't even care about civil liberties much in the United States, much less in Europe. So Italy became a favorite. Big businessmen loved fascist Italy. Liberals loved fascist Italy until about 1935. In other words, until the Italian-Ethiopian War, when foreign policy got in the way, Mussolini was beloved in the New York Times and all the other organs of established opinion. What Mencken used to call right-thinking opinion. A writer in Scribner's Magazine hailed the World War I. He said, professors in all countries, means the United States and all the warring countries, but get this, professors in all countries, quote, fought. They weren't really on the front lines. They fought in the sense of being in Washington or Berlin or something. They fought and they managed affairs, thus refuting the ancient libelous assumption that they constitute an absent-minded third sex, unquote. So they're really macho. You see, the professors prove they can be macho by being out there and planning and coercing like everybody else. That's great, boy. That's a super accomplishment. Another thing that starts in World War I, several other things should be mentioned. The idea of public housing, federal public housing, begins in World War I with Franklin Roosevelt in the Navy Department building naval base housing, getting the idea of that. Government dams, government electric power starts in World War I as part of the Muscle Shoals nitrate plant in Tennessee, which starts the idea of the TVA, later the TVA. During the 1920s, it was pushed by Hoover, the idea of a dam, like government electricity, government dams, and Muscle Shoals, and also, of course, in Colorado River near Las Vegas, which used to be, I forget now what it's named now. It kept being renamed. I've forgotten now it's either the Boulder, I think it's the Boulder Dam. When the Democrats got in, they called it the Boulder Dam. The Republicans got in, they renamed it the Hoover Dam. The Democrats have then changed, I guess it's Boulder. Now here's an example of government operation, and a little bit of socialism, so to speak. You think, therefore, the private electric companies would be against it. They were not against it. Private electric companies have always been in favor of government electric power plants. Why? Because what happened, well, for one thing, the government builds the plants at taxpayers' expense, provides cheap electricity, subsidizing electricity users at taxpayer expense, and usually the private electric companies then buy the electricity from the government dams and resell it to consumers. So they love it. It all depends. The idea that business automatically dislikes government intervention is totally incorrect. Should be one of the key lessons of this course. It's almost the opposite. It depends again what they're doing. So here we have a situation where the government's providing cheap power for electric companies. Fantastic. Roosevelt, when he set up the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, in 1933 or so, said he harked back to the World War I experience. He said the World War I, the power developments of the war days in TVA, Tennessee, shows that leads logically, as he said, the national planning. So it all started with this wartime precedent. Also, another thing which starts in World War I was the so-called Garden City development. Beginning of the the garden city concept, where public housing, government build planned cities. They did it in New Jersey and Delaware and Connecticut. This is based on the crazed housing theories of a British intellectual named Ebenezer Howard, I guess his name was. And the idea is everybody should live in a planned city. There should be a certain amount of open space. There should be gardens everywhere, and all the rest of this nonsense, which of course led to essentially World War II public housing developments, which we're only now getting away from. In other words, the architectural theory. Everybody's supposed to live in a way the architects think we should live. It's finally being beaten back by hard experience. It turns out people don't want to live in garden cities. They like to live in neighborhoods and things like that. And the whole idea that a few left-wing architects are supposed to plan where everybody's going to live really begins to take root in World War I. There's not very much, but the seeds of it begin there. As I say, it sprouts until about the 60s and 70s. 1960s, I think it was, Jane Jacobs writes a magnificent book, which I recommend everybody, called The Rise and Fall of American Cities, I think is the name of it, in which he attacks this whole idea of the planned city and the planned housing developments as being rotten and causing all sorts of terrible social consequences. As I say, unions grow enormously in World War I as a result of this coerced. Franklin Roosevelt, who was part of the Labor, Assistant Secretary of Navy and in charge of the Navy Department's labor policies, one of the leaders in this coerced union thing. And again, he learned from that to put into effect and put in the NRA in 1933, and then the Wagner Act in 1935, the idea of coerced unionism. So the war was over. Most of these guys fought like hell to keep the system going, even though the war was over. Baruch wanted to continue it. Hoover wanted to continue it, but to some extent it did continue until the summer of 1919. The wheat price was kept up by the federal government until June or July 1919. Finally, it peters out. For one thing, Secretary Baker, Secretary of War, was sort of in favor of the free market. I mean, sort of against continuing. He really thought this should only be for wartime. And so he led the idea of getting rid of it. Oh, one of the things, this is a really remarkable thing that the government did. The government created a government union. This is a remarkable point which has been overlooked by most historians. And the lumber industries in the West, the forests in the West, were most of the unions, to the extent they were unionized, were in the hands of a radical anarchist union called the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. Which sort of the left-wing anarcho-syndicalists, I guess would be the best way to describe them. Industrial Workers of the World was strong in the logging industries in the Northwest and the mines and the lumber in general, in Idaho and in eastern Washington State and things like that. So, since the IWW, being anarchists, were against the war, against entry into the war, they were striking and creating problems. So the federal government set up its own loggers union. It's a pretty remarkable development. In the summer of 1917, the government set up the Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen, the so-called 4L movement. It was a so-called union headed by a general. It's the first time any general has been head of a union in the United States. The general's name is Bryce Disk. So we had army officers, generals and army officers running the so-called union. General Bryce Disk, D-I-S-Q-U-E. Disk, anyway. So this is a government, a union that was organized by the U.S. Army, and in which the lumbermen more or less dragooned by force. In other words, first of all, the IWW is outlawed, and its leaders were rounded up in jail for the rest of the war and later. And second of all, the lumbermen were sort of dragooned into this organization, the 4L movement. So it was organized by the U.S. War Department, is what it was called then, and in November 1917. So it was headed, Colonel Bryce Disk. He wasn't a general yet. He became a general later. Colonel Disk and a whole bunch of about 100 Army officers organized this union. And they called it 4Lism. And a Signal Corps division of 10,000 men were assigned to it, to sort of run it, to sort of head it up and make sure that everybody was working out. And they organized lumber camps under the Army and the Signal Corps, and they purchased lumber, and also they really became a leading light in the lumber industry. They imposed an 8-hour day on the lumber industry. They wanted the unions were fighting for an 8-hour day. I guess it was 10 hours then. So the Army decided to impose it, and so we had the Army Union running the lumber industry, and then ordering the lumber operators to have an 8-hour day and to bargain with a so-called union. And they established a minimum wage for the lumber industry, and they had improved working conditions and whatever. And then they had a bill empowering the president to seize any mill or lumber camp that refused to abide by these union regulations. It was really like a government union, or army union, which then essentially ran the industry. By the end of the war, the 4L movement, the Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen, had a membership of 120,000 men, which really constituted the entire lumber industry in the United States. Every union member had to sign a loyalty oath. And the loyalty oath went as follows. I, the undersigned, in consideration of my being a member of the Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen, do hereby solemnly pledge my efforts during the war to the United States of America, and will support and defend this country against enemies both foreign and domestic. I like that, domestic. What is a domestic enemy supposed to be? Well, it's anybody that's opposed to the war effort, for one thing. Anybody that doesn't obey the Army-Union regulation. I further agree by these presents to faithfully perform my duty toward this company, that means whatever company they're working for, by directing my best efforts in every way possible to the production of logs and lumber for the construction of Army airplanes and ships to be used against our common enemies. You notice, this is essentially coerced, essentially forced labor situation here. And that I will stamp out any sedition or acts of hostility against the U.S. government which may come into my knowledge, and will do every act and thing which will in general aid in carrying this war to a successful conclusion. So these were the labor conscripts, so to speak, in the lumber camps. And Colonel Disk and the whole army began to think of this. Well, the heck with the war effort. The war effort is only beginning. This is going to be a permanent labor market in this country where we can organize all the working force into a loyal legion of whatever. It doesn't have to be only lumbermen to obey the government, to obey the corporatist dictates. They said this is the end of class war. See, we can end class war. We're going to have class harmony now. What they call 4Lism. They use the term. They thought of this as a philosophy, as a way of life, labor management relations. 4L, pronounced 4Lism. And they wanted to continue it when the war was over. Unfortunately for us, or unfortunately for them, the end of the war meant the end of coercion. They couldn't no longer compel people to join the union. The union began to die out. So by 1930, they still continued during the 1920s. By 1930, they only had about a few thousand members. But they really continued in business for about 12 years after the war was over, more than that. And when the New Deal came in the 1930s, 4Lism revived in the CCC camps, the something Conservation Corps. I think Citizens, which was set up by the New Deal to solve the problem of unemployment, quote unquote. The way you solve the problem of unemployment is you get people into the government service. Okay? The idea was Civilian Conservation Corps, excuse me, that's what it was. Civilian Conservation Corps. Set up in 1933 to combat the Depression. The idea is you take unemployed youths from the cities and get them out of the healthy climate of the country and get them to chop trees or build dams or whatever it is. And the New Dealers loved this. They thought it was a great thing. It's a way of essentially militarizing the labor force, of bringing in a whiff of the Army. It was really run by the Army, U.S. Army. And one of the theories was, for example, quote, to mobilize the unemployed youth into a forestry army. Then, of course, in the meantime, you train them for any future war effort. You get them, sort of lead them in if a Second World War should break out. There'd be a corps, a cadre. They were equipped, the CCC people, even though they're technically civilians, were put in some army-type camps in the country. They were equipped with army-type uniforms. They were gathered in army recruiting stations. They were living in army tents, and they were run essentially by the U.S. Army. The guy who was the head of it was a guy named Robert Fechner, who was a former war labor, leader of the former War Labor Board. Again, harking back to the World War I experience. Richard T. Ely, one of his last books, I think he lived until the age until late 30s, but he was pretty old by this time. Founder of progressive economics, I'm already mentioned. Richard T. Ely writes, by the way, Richard T. Ely was also a post-millennialist pietist. He also believed that government is God's major instrument of redemption. Redeems the citizens of the world through government. Anyway, in 1931, to combat the Depression, Richard T. Ely writes a book where he proposes a peacetime army. Notice again the military connotations. A peacetime army recruiting the unemployed to be directed, quote, by an economic general staff. And this army, quote, should go to work to relieve the stress with all the vigor and resources of brain and brawn that we employed in the World War, unquote. Again, you have a mighty alliance of militarism, intellectuals, and corporate state. I think, as I mentioned before, the automobile industry began as very small, began in bicycle shops. The bicycles, by the way, are an important harbinger of, if you're interested in this area, there's a very good book by David Hounshaw, called From American System to Mass Production. And he talks about the great importance in the 1890s of the bicycle industry. Before that, the bicycle was, if you remember from old movies, was shaped like this. I think it was, and you sat on top of this very big wheel. So it was unsafe. First of all, you couldn't go very fast. Second of all, it kept falling over. So it was only used by people, a small number of people, sort of aficionados. Then some guy in England invented the safety bicycle, what was then known as a safety bicycle, which we know and love today, namely equal wheels and a chain axle system linking them up. So as a result of this invention of the so-called safety bicycle, which was imported, the first big bicycle manufacturer in the United States, which made safety bicycles, was a guy named Pope Bicycle Company. And the bicycle was a big boom. I had the figures at home. A big boom in the 1890s. I think a huge number, like millions of bicycles per year, was sold for about a 10-year period. And the thing about bicycles is technologically it got people got technicians and craftsmen and mechanics used to the idea of the rubber tire and the axle. I mean, the axle wheel rubber tire complex, which hadn't been really done before. Because before the wheels were railroad wheels and they didn't have rubber tires, they didn't have this whole system. Secondly, you got the public used to the idea of mobility. In other words, of starting at one point that you prefer and going to another point you prefer without schlepping down to the railroad terminal and waiting for the schedules. In other words, a railroad transportation means you go down as a terminal. It's fixed terminals and fixed tracks and fixed times. You go there and then you walk or take a horse and carriage or something, horse and buggy the rest of the way. So people's transportation before the 1890s was over land was fixed time schedules and fixed terminals. All of a sudden, with a bicycle, people got used to the idea of individually controlled transportation, going anywhere you want, not the fixed terminals, going whatever time you want to boot, stopping along the way and all that. In other words, total individual control and mobility of transportation. So the automobile came in, and it paved the way for the automobile in two ways. One, technologically, the axle, wheel, tire techniques, and two, philosophically, so to speak. In other words, people got used to, wanted to have more of this, wanted to be able to drive faster and all that. So the same idea of individual mobility then gets picked up, of course, with the automobile. Now, originally, the automobile, as I said, was made either in old bicycle shops, old blacksmith shops, or old carriage manufacturing shops. There's only a few a year, a few a month or whatever, very small, and a huge number of automobile firms, hundreds in the automobile industry, which came in and then collapsed and whatever. And at first, it took a long time to find the economic way to do it. Most early automobiles were extremely expensive and for rich people. In other words, and it was sort of a plaything for the rich. If you were Astor or Vanderbilt, you got an automobile for whatever, $20,000 or whatever it was. And they were very fancy. They were beautiful. They were hand tooled, whatever it is, and all the rest of it, as antique automobile lovers can attest. But they weren't an economic factor. And the thing which gave rise to the dominance of Henry Ford, one of the geniuses in this thing, was that he was the first guy to say, look, the hell with this plaything and the rich stuff. I want to make an automobile for the general public, an automobile for the masses. To do that, it's got to be cheap, no frills. It's got to be cheap. It's got to be, therefore, very low cost and lots of them. And so the whole idea was, for them, was to gear the automobile as a mass product. And this is why the Ford Motor Company grew from a small blacksmith shop to a mighty 4 million car a year outfit. So going along that line, it was Ford who then said, well, if it's going to be a given product, first of all, it's going to be a uniform product. It's not going to be hand tool or handcrafted. And it was really Ford that brought into American industry to the fullest extent the modern concept of mass production and interchangeable parts. That's interchangeable parts, each of which is manufactured and fit together, not by the craftsman, not by hand fitting, but by machine. In other words, machine-produced interchangeable parts. It was because of that that Ford was able to turn out mass production and cheap product and those uniform products. And his whole organization was geared toward this end, and to, as I say, for a cheap car, and therefore a cheap, low-cost car. It used to be thought back in the 1920s that Ford really invented mass production, and it was called Fordism. So during the 1920s, we had in the early 30s, there were arguments about, is Fordism good or bad? And then it was the revisionists came along and said that it wasn't really, Ford didn't really begin mass production. It was really begun in the 19th century, or way before that, with the McCormick Reaper and the Singer sewing machine, even with arms production. Now, however, with the Hounshow book, there's a re-revisionism. He goes through a very detailed analysis of all these guys, and he comes to the conclusion that Ford really did invent mass production in the modern sense. It's back to Ford, in other words. Because he said McCormick and all these guys, it's true there was a large production, and there's interchangeable parts in one sense, but the interchangeable parts were not machine produced. They were all fitted together by hand craftsmen. So he took the parts and fitted them. So it wasn't really what we consider modern mass production. It really begins with Ford. So we have, with Ford, of course, then invent the assembly line as part of this process. In other words, the assembly line then makes it much, much quicker because you have the thing rolling. It takes the factory and builds it up to its highest point, so to speak. Because not only do you have all the people and raw materials and whatever concentrated in one spot, which is what happens with a factory, you also have the moving assembly line, which rolls on, and then uniform things are done to it, and the car comes out at the end. And so Ford begins mass production. He has enormous, I think it was 1913 or a little later, he builds the River Rouge plant, which is the mightiest mass production factory ever built up to that point. I think maybe even since. I think it was 1913, the River Rouge. What he kept doing is keep reducing the amount of time it takes to produce one car. In other words, I think when he started this mass production, it took 13 hours to produce one car. Like one car was coming off the assembly line every 13 hours. And then as he kept improving and getting it bigger and more mechanized, it got down to an hour and a half, 3 hours, hour and a half, hour and a quarter. And finally, by the 1920s, it was down to a car per minute. In other words, at the maximum point of the River Rouge plant, one car is coming off assembly lines per minute. It was a magnificent achievement. Okay, so Ford then takes over the automobile industry, becomes a dominant force by this kind of innovation. From 2% of the automobile industry, he went up to about 50, 60% of the industry. By 1914 or so, there were two large companies at that point, as the Ford and other people kept growing and the others kept dropping out. For example, the electric car, the steam car. Now, there were electric cars and steam cars. Unfortunately, they didn't accelerate very well. They were expensive. They didn't accelerate very well. I should say before I get to the other firm, the other innovation of Ford, so Ford had two great innovations. One was the whole concept of mass production, interchangeable parts, all that, moving assembly line. And the other one was marketing, which is just as important as production. In order to sell this stuff, in order to produce this stuff, you also have to sell it. So it was Ford that really developed the idea of branch supply plants, of branch distribution plants, of franchise dealers who sell the car on the retailers and then can turn back the amount to the wholesalers of the manufacturer, etc. It was creating the whole worldwide marketing system to sell the cars, because if you produce a couple of million cars a year, you also have to sell them. And so that the whole mass marketing process was developed by Ford too. So it was an enormous achievement. And again, he started, I think he started poor, he was a self-made man. Again, it's a Horatio Alger concept. I forget where he grew up. Of course, he wound up in Michigan very early, apprentice and all that. I think he was an apprentice bicycle machine shop person, and gets plows back profits, borrows money from relatives, and plows back some profits. Had nothing to do with the banks, as a matter of fact, till he died. Practically had nothing to do with Wall Street bankers. As a result, his political views were not part of the establishment. He was a maverick type in general. Until his grandson took over, and his grandson was in with the Wall Street banks, and immediately changed his viewpoint to sort of liberal Republican or moderate Republican, which is, I guess, his official establishment view. At any rate, the other company that was growing up fast by 1913, 1918 was General Motors, which grew up by merger. In other words, it really, instead of developing by innovation and by productive work, so to speak, it merged a whole bunch of other companies, Buick, all these things which we now think of as divisions of General Motors, were originally independent companies, Olds and with different manufacturers, Olds and Buick, Mr. Buick and Mr. Packard and all that sort of stuff. And they merged into DuPont. And the merger, merged into General Motors, the merger being promoted by Morgan. One of these merger persons, was named Charles Stewart Mott. I forget, I think he originally had I forget what he had. He had an axle company or something, a Mott company, and they merged into General Motors around this period, 1915 or so. And Mr. Champion had the Champion Spark Plug company that became part of General Motors. Well, Mott, in a sense, owned Flint, Michigan. He only died a few years ago, at the age of 90 or something. And he had like 100,000 shares of General Motors. And of course, that developed over the years. So he virtually owned Flint, Michigan. The whole town of Flint, the city of Flint, is essentially Mottsville. And they got a statue of Mott, whatever. His son, Stuart Mott, is a big left-winger, and I guess as an heir, and contributed a lot of money to left-wing causes. So Durant, by about 1919, 1920, was getting General Motors on the point of collapse. Remember, they had merged. They hadn't really achieved their big size through any kind of productive effort. And they were just collapsing. They were literally going bankrupt. They couldn't hack it compared to Ford. And so, at the point of collapse, Morgan and DuPont, the DuPont family, which is essentially owned General Motors, took over General Motors, owned it, owned a huge percentage of General Motors stock. Basically, General Motors was DuPont until the Supreme Court forced them to divest around the 1950s or 60s. But at any rate, so DuPont didn't know what to do with this company. It was falling apart, and they by happenstance, they got a management genius to take it over, to be the head of it, named Alfred P. Sloan. And Sloan reconstructed General Motors to make it not only a viable corporation, but even outdoing Ford. Sloan did several things. First of all, he reorganized General Motors into the modern committee system. In other words, Ford literally ran the company all by himself. He had a few yes men, and that was it. And he ran the whole thing, and he was against the idea of structure. And it was essentially Sloan that put in the whole quasi-decentralized committee structure that most corporations have now adopted in the United States. In other words, executive committee and then different lines, independent branches, each with their own policy, and then they're coordinated by the center. So sort of a semi-decentralized system with flow charts and specific lines of responsibility and all that, and hierarchical structure. And Ford was very much opposed to this. And there's a speech, I have it at home, I should have brought it. A speech of his in the early 1920s, around 1923, and he's saying, I'm against all this junk. I'm against at Ford, we have no lines of command, we have no structure, nobody knows what he's going to do. There's no what's now called job description. Everybody does everything. And of course, Ford is running everything with the help of a few yes men. And the problem with running everything turned out, as the Ford Motor Company grew, it was just too much for the guy to do. I mean, one person can't really handle all this stuff, and it got to be a point of inefficiency of management. It got to be top-heavy. So it turned out, in addition to this, we had this regularized accounting, auditing flow. Each department was audited and had yearly goals, and all the stuff we're all very familiar with now, and management courses and all that. It's really slowing the start of this whole business. They sort of regularize or formalize structure, job descriptions, auditing of each division, making sure each division is making a profit, or at least not making losses. All that sort of stuff begins with General Motors. So it was a tremendous improvement in managerial technique. They, of course, also built up the marketing system imitating Ford. They did one better. They started financing their own dealers. In other words, here we have an average dealer wants to sell cars, doesn't got much money. General Motors Acceptance Corporation is set up to finance, lend money to the dealers. So this is an important innovation in marketing, financing dealers. Also built up dealer loyalty and all that. And the third thing they did, again, is a marketing innovation. Ford believed, if you have this huge, he believed in a huge plant. If you have a huge plant, you make it very cheap. You can have a cheap car. But that's the good thing. The bad thing is you have to have a uniform product. So he was stuck with a River Route train with uniform, 4 million Model T Fords every year. Model T was his basic design. And it was lovable. It was a great car. Unfortunately, it was boring. In other words, first of all, it was all black color. He was against colors. He said, cars have always been black, sort of an old curmudgeon type, and lovable, but on the other hand, cars have always been, therefore it's got to be black all the time. Of course, it costs money, you see, to change colors and to change models. He didn't believe in annual model changes. The Model T is it. The Model T is there forever, and that's it. General Motors Sloan realized that the public wants, as the public's getting more affluent, getting more used to cars, they like to have changes, innovations, fashion changes, more different colors, different styles. So as General Motors innovated in the mid-1920s the idea of annual model changes and different colors. As a matter of fact, the idea was more than that, different colors. General Motors coined the slogan, a car for every purse. In other words, they started the idea of different lines where you have expensive cars, medium-sized cars, and cheap cars. So you have the Cadillac for wealthier people, and the Chevrolet for less lower income people, et cetera, et cetera. You have a whole structure, a whole line structure. A car for every pocket, for every purse. So Ford only believed in one cheap car, the Model T, and that's it. So as a result of that, as a result of Ford sticking to his tried and true methods, and General Motors being more flexible because having a smaller, not believing in as big a plant, having several plants, each of which will do different things, and then changing every year, being more flexible, General Motors was able to come out-compete Ford and providing a better product in the sense of a bigger choice for the consumer than changes. A lot of these model changes are attacked by leftists as being frippery. On the other hand, people like it, even if it is frippery. People like to have cars that are a little bit different instead of having the same boring car year after year. And why not? What's wrong with that? So at any rate, Ford began to lose a lot of money. Ford Motor Company, sticking all during the 1920s to the old Model T, cheaper, only in the sense, cheaper except that you're stuck with this product. You can't change models. In other words, in business you have to make choices. And one of the choices is being inflexible, having a huge plant which is very low cost, but you're stuck with it. It costs an enormous amount to change the product. Having a slightly higher cost but more flexible product where you can keep making changes. So this is an important choice to be made. If that's something, and you can't sort of do it a priori. You have to have your feel for the market. Anyway, Ford began to lose a lot of money for about 10 years. And General Motors began to gain, and it was that period from 1925 to 33 or something, which entrenched General Motors as the dominant automobile firm, and Ford then became second rank. Ford was only be able to save, but finally Ford threw in the towel, shut down for a year or two, I think for about 2 years, in order to make these changes, to reduce the size and have different models, and try to catch up with General Motors, which then became almost impossible. At least they started adopting the same techniques of, annual model. Now there's no real difference between Ford and General Motors in that sense. They all have a whole structure of cars, and they change kind of different colors, and they change models. But the General Motors set the pace for this, and everybody was able to obtain dominance in the industry. And it wasn't dominant because a lot of money was poured into it. The money was going down the tubes until Sloan started this whole new process, whole new thinking about automobiles. Chrysler came, even though Chrysler began to go bankrupt recently, Chrysler really only begins around 1925 and comes up very rapidly, so it becomes a major company by about the mid-30s. again through these modern techniques of good management techniques, good marketing, whatever. In 1920, as the country revulsion against the war, against the outcome of the war against Woodrow Wilson, Republican nomination becomes important. There's a big fight for Republican nomination. The guy who was supported by the Morgans and the Rockefellers, for that matter, mostly the Morgans, was General Leonard Wood, who was an old friend of Teddy Roosevelt, who had just died recently. And it was General Wood who begins the fight for the draft and universal military training around 1913 or 14. 1914, really, just as the war starts. So he had the Morgan cachet, so to speak. He was one of his backers, for example, was Morgan's son-in-law, and Stimson and Lodge and Root. All these people Morgan himself were backing Wood. The other big candidate was Governor Loudon of Illinois, who was was married to a Pullman heiress, and therefore had the Pullman fortune. He had sort of a personal fortune. He didn't have much big business backing, but he had his own money, or his wife's money, that he could pour into the married Pullman. So there was a big fight between Loudon and Wood, and it looked as if neither of them could really get the nomination, at which point a compromise candidate was worked out, namely Senator Harding of Ohio. Now, it's true that Harding being from Ohio, was automatically a Rockefeller person. Although the equation wasn't as, absolute as it used to be. Rockefeller had moved to New York, but still in all, Ohio republicanism still meant strong Rockefeller influence. Harding was a very small town newspaper publisher. I mean, really small town. A town with a couple of thousand people. And, but he was backed, of course, by the Ohio Republican Party, and by Boyce Penrose, who was the boss of Pennsylvania. And the Morgans finally decided he was okay. In other words, the George Harvey, who was the guy who got Woodrow Wilson on the road to politics, the head of Harper and Brothers, and a close friend of J.P. Morgan, was on the scene there. He was in constant touch with 4 Morgan partners, and they told him, "Okay, Harding is okay. We prefer Wood, but we'll settle for Harding." And so Loudon was kind of erratic, and who knows. So anyway, the Morgans then backed Harding as their second choice. By the way, Harding was also a friend of Judge Gary, the head of U.S. Steel, parenthesis Morgan. So that was another recommendation. He was so close to Gary that Gary gave a job to Harding's top mistress. Harding had a bunch of mistresses. His major mistress was Nan Britton, and she's looking for employment, so Gary gives her a no-show job. So at any rate, the Morgans felt that Harding was fairly safe. And Harding then sweeps into the presidency because of the revulsion against the Democrats. Harding's cabinet was like a Morgan-Rockefeller coalition. Basically, even though a lot of Morgan people in the cabinet, the basic deal was made, I think, between Morgan and Rockefeller. I can't substantiate it. I think it's pretty true. By this time, oil was now very big. There's a big oil war continuing between the Standard Oil on the one hand, all over the world, and the Rothschild Royal Dutch Shell combination. Essentially, the Morgan said, "Okay, we'll allow a pro-oil foreign policy." In other words, the United States will back Standard Oil all over the world. In the Middle East, for example, which was just then becoming a growing oil center, Iran and Iraq, it was then Persia and Iraq, discovered oil. There was a big fight between the British and the Russians and so forth and so on, and who should get the oil concession. And the British and the United States, the British backing Royal Dutch Shell, and the Americans backing Standard Oil. So Secretary of State was the key foreign policy position, went to a Rockefeller person, namely Charles Evans Hughes, who had run for president in 1916 and just lost it. So-called progressive lawyer, New York, former governor of New York, and lawyer for Standard Oil Company, top lawyer for Standard Oil, and also a personal lawyer for John D. Rockefeller and dealing with his estate, so very close to the Rockefeller empire. Trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation. You have to realize these foundations are not neutrals. If you see that somebody's a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation, it means he's a Rockefeller person. He's in the Rockefeller ambit. I mean, I will not suddenly get selected as a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation, okay? And you will not either. So these jobs are carefully selected as plums to their top people. He was also a law partner Hughes, of a guy named George Sherman, whose older brother, Jacob Sherman, was a very close friend of John D. Rockefeller as well. So there's a very close Rockefeller connection here. Hughes then left after he was Secretary of State in the 1920s. He then was appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which he continued to be all during the 1930s. So Hughes was running the foreign policy, obviously a pro-Standard Oil foreign policy. By the way, it got to the point in the late 1920s, around 1928, 29, several books were written forecasting an actual war between the United States and Britain. Ludwell Denny, who was a big shot journalist then, wrote a book called America's Oil War, which is a war between U.S. and Britain. They were expecting war to break out because of this big oil conflict between Standard Oil on the one hand, and Standard Oil was trying to get concessions in the Middle East. Britain already had concessions from for its Anglo-Persian Oil Company and whatever, all the other Royal Dutch Shell affiliates. And the United States was trying to get a part of it. And finally, of course, the deal was worked out. The United States and Britain did not go to war. But for many years in the 1920s, there was actually serious concern that a war might break out. Secretary of the Treasury was a figure who was continued to be Secretary of Treasury all during the 20s, Andrew Mellon. This is the first time I can think of where a top tycoon actually takes over as an important political post. Mellon, of course, is parenthesis Mellon. And Mellon's a multi-millionaire, almost billionaire, I would say billionaire family, still is, which virtually owns Pittsburgh and everything in it. Mellon's essentially own Alcoa and Gulf Oil and Mellon Bank and God knows what else. I mean, it's various other business firms. Coppers Company, Pittsburgh Consolidated, and coal, and a whole bunch of other things. Anyway, the Mellons, so Mellon's really parenthesis Mellon. We have to realize Mellons and Morgans have been allied for quite a while. When Pittsburgh went Mellon, Morgan, when Carnegie and Frick were merged to become U.S. Steel, the Mellons were involved in that. So you have a Mellon-Morgan alliance. There still is a Mellon, of course, a big Mellon family and a Mellon foundations and everything else. Under Secretary of Treasury, appointed by Mellon, was S. Parker Gilbert, who later became a Morgan partner. Always look, of course, for Morgan partners. So this symbolizes the Mellon-Morgan alliance. The Rockefellers were sort of parceling out of the situation. Rockefellers were willing to, the Morgans were actually, after all, dominant in the finance. They were willing to have the Morgans take first place in the Treasury as long as they got the first shot, the important shot on foreign policy. Attorney General was an Ohio crony with various connections of Harding. The Secretary of War was a Morgan person from Massachusetts. As a partner of Vice President of the First National Bank of Boston, which of course is Boston, Baum, and Morgan. Secretary of the Navy was a guy from Michigan who was close to the Packard Motor Company, a Detroit lawyer. His assistant secretary of the Navy was Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of Theodore Roosevelt Sr., and Morgan person, of course. Secretary of Labor, this is kind of cute. The Secretary of Labor is a guy named James J. Davis. It's cute because Davis, even though he had once been a union member, a long time before, the Amalgamated Steel Union or something, was now a businessman and banker in Pittsburgh, and therefore, of course, a Mellon person. So it's sort of like giving Mellon two cabinet posts. And the labor unions, of course, were all PO'd at this, they did not regard Davis as a union labor person. Secretary of Interior was another buddy of Harding from New Mexico. The ambassador to Great Britain was George Harvey. This is the guy, the Morgan representative who was finally pushing for Harding, became his payoff as ambassador to Great Britain, etc. One of the interesting things that happened in Harding administration was the so-called Teapot Dome scandal, which I'm not going to go into. It got a lot of publicity. It wasn't really that vital, but anyway, it was a situation where government oil land was leased out to Harry Sinclair, who bribed the Secretary of Interior, etc. But the interesting thing about it is essentially that was a Morgan ploy. Behind Sinclair were the Morgans. There's some interesting studies have been made of this. And, of course, Sinclair was a competitor to Standard Oil. And this is sort of a Morgan ploy. And I think the I think the exposure and the hysteria about DeFi Dome is essentially a Rockefeller product. I can't prove that because it hasn't been studied for that reason. When after the Soviet Union took over, after Lenin took over, they were willing to make deals with American and foreign capitalists. The question is who should get the Baku oil concession, a lot of oil land in Russia and the Caucasus. And both Rockefeller and Sinclair, was an independent oil person, were competing for a concession. Sinclair finally got it. And Rockefeller was extremely bitter at this. And I think the Teapot Dome exposure, the whole hysteria about Teapot Dome, congressional investigation and the press, was essentially a Rockefeller ploy to smash the Morgans and Sinclair in that particular fight. A successful one. Harding dies suddenly in office, 1923. My contention is whenever a president dies suddenly, he should at least be investigated. That's my contention. I mean, some people do die suddenly for natural causes. When a president dies suddenly, he should be investigated with a little more depth than usual. There are some contention that he was bumped off, Harding. One contention is he was poisoned by his wife. His wife had several grievances. First of all, he was sleeping around a lot, as already indicated. Second of all, the Teapot Dome scandal was just coming out. He himself was not a crook. He was a poker-playing friend of crooks. And a little bit like Koch, I guess. He's not directly a crook. But anyway, the scandal was coming out, and she didn't want his name blackened, plus the fact that she was sort of resentful anyway. Anyway, there are contentions that she poisoned him. I'm not saying she did, but what I'm saying is it should be at least have been investigated. Obviously it wasn't. The guy who was a Secret Service agent wrote a book a few years later claiming that she poisoned him. But anyway, that's as may be. At any rate, once again, a Rockefeller person dies suddenly in office and a Morgan person succeeds him. Just as Teddy Roosevelt suddenly succeeded McKinley, Harding was now succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, who was the vice president. And what Coolidge brought with him was a totally Morgan administration. In other words, Rockefeller's administration was a combination, Harding's was a coalition between Rockefeller and Morgan. Coolidge brings with him a pure Morgan administration. Coolidge himself is usually considered to be silent Cal, and was quiet. He was a governor of Massachusetts, and he cracked down on a police strike. He arrested cops who wanted to strike. The important thing about Coolidge, however, he was an attorney in western Massachusetts. True, he was head of a small savings bank, an attorney, but the key thing is he had many top backers. His cousin, for example, were Coolidge's. T. Jefferson Coolidge, one of his cousin and top backer, was a big shot in United Fruit Company in Boston and in with the Morgan Boston Financial Group. In other words, I think he was head of United Fruit, Old Colony Bank, and all that. So T. Jefferson Coolidge, well-known top financier, was a cousin of Calvin. So the fact that Calvin himself came from a small town in western Massachusetts doesn't mean much. The point is, what are his family connections? His major mentor, he also had two other mentors, but this one was cousin. His major mentor was a guy named W. Murray Crane, who was the governor of Massachusetts. I think he was a congressman of Massachusetts, and chairman of the Republican Party of Massachusetts, a paper manufacturer, and also a leading Morgan person in Massachusetts. He was a director of AT&T, which is a Morgan company, American telephone telegraph, and basically a Boston Morgan person. In fact, when Coolidge's first act as president was to appoint Crane's top assistant, William Butler, to be head of the Republican National Committee. That was his direct, immediate payoff for Crane's support. His other top backer is none other than Dwight Morrow, close friend of Coolidge and Morgan partner. So we have with all this backing silent Cal Coolidge, we can be assured of the fact that Coolidge administration will be Morganite. And indeed, his whole administration was top Morgan. His Secretary of State, when Hughes resigned as Secretary of State in 1925, year after, actually just about when Coolidge was elected in 24 he comes in as vice president, and then he gets elected in 1924 in his own right.